And one major concern is also the great impact on lives and property by the destruction from a glacial lake outburst flood. And this is an increasing risk due to the creation of an expanse of glacial lakes resulting from glacial retreat as well. Next, please. So, the global average sea level rose by 17 centimeters during the 20th century, and it's projected to rise an additional 18 to 59 centimeters by year 2100, and this will have a devastating impact on coastal areas of the world. Next, please. We're also facing increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. As an example, under warmer conditions, hurricanes and typhoons are more frequent and intense. Next. And not only biodiversity, but also ecosystem services are affected because ecosystems, which are critically important for human well-being, are already under threat to the land use changes and habitat destructions, like deforestation or over-harvesting, and climate change is an added stress to this, and it's likely to exacerbate habitat loss through, for example, deforestation and forest fires and desertification. Climate change is also likely to trigger species migration, and certain ecosystems such as mountains and coasts, including mangroves and coral reefs, are particularly susceptible to impact of climate change. The poor in developing world, those who have contributed less to, or the least to causing climate change, are the people who experience it more severely. And the negative impacts are likely to be most serious in the tropics and subtropics, where the majority of developing countries are located and where the capacity to adapt to changes is most limited. The combined challenges of climate change, environmental degradation, and persistent impoverishments render developing societies extremely vulnerable to climate risks and undermine their ability to cope and adapt to change. And the main impacts on human development are reduced agricultural productivity, increased water insecurity, increased exposure to extreme weather events, collapse of ecosystem and environmental services, and increased health risks. And the climate change has particularly heavy impact on certain sectors, namely agriculture, forestry, water, coastal zones, and ecosystem. Okay, next, please. So now we'll look at some responses to climate change. Next, please. There are feasible strategies to deal with climate change. Climate change mitigation and adaptation are two complementary risk management strategies. And while mitigation deals with reducing the magnitude of global warming and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, adaptation reduces the vulnerability to climate change impacts, and it reduces human and material losses. And we should stabilize greenhouse gases at a level that prevents dangerous human interference with the climate system. And avoiding this level of warming by the year 2100 will require substantial global emission reductions. Next, please. Some economists have tried to estimate the aggregate net economic cost of damages from climate change across the globe. One widely publicized report is the Stern Review. And according to the Stern Review, tackling climate change now is entirely possible and will cost us only 1% of the global GDP. Strong action will not have a significant effect on economic growth, and in some cases it will actually make money. And Stern's report suggests that climate change threatens to be the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. And it provides prescriptions, including environmental taxes, to minimize the economic and social disruptions. Next, please. These are the Bali Action Plan building blocks today. After last year's United Nations Climate Change Conference in Bali, the participating nations adopted the Bali Roadmap as a 2-year process to finalizing a binding agreement in Denmark next year for the post-Kyoto or post-2012 framework. And the Bali Roadmap recognizes that adaptation is essential, but there are substantial limits and barriers. And it also states that mitigation is economically and technologically feasible. Next, please. So then, what is climate change adaptation? Next, please. As even the best mitigation efforts cannot avoid the severe impacts of climate change in the next few decades, adaptation measures need to be taken urgently. The IPCC defines adaptation as the adjustment in natural or human systems to a new or changing environment which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. In other words, it's managing the unavoidable. Next, please. So we can lower the impacts of climate change with mitigation, and we can lower the cost of climate change with adaptation, but we cannot reduce the risks to zero. Ideally, we would like to know the daily weather for any place or any specific day in the future, so that we could prepare and adapt our economic structures and systems. However, we have a less ideal reality, and we are limited with knowledge and resources, and climate change forces us to learn how to make decisions in a world of uncertainty, change, and surprises. Successful countries do not design public policies for a best estimate future, but they know the range of possible futures that may be in stock. So now different adaptation options. Adapting to climate change entails adjustment and changes at all levels, from local communities to national governments and institutions, and the international actors as well. Local communities must build their resilience to climate change, including through making most of their traditional knowledge, diversifying their livelihoods, and adopting appropriate technologies. At the same time, ministries and government, as well as institutions and NGOs, must integrate climate change into their planning and into their budget. And adaptation is a process. It begins with understanding the current vulnerabilities, then building capacity to support adaptation planning and implementation, and learning from the pilot actions, and finally, implementing strategies and measures for adaptation in vulnerable regions and sectors and populations. As the developing countries are often described as having a low adaptive capacity to climate change, while this is true, at the same time we must remember that in many communities in developing countries, they have always had to cope with changing environments and variable climates. And they have developed some effective strategies to cope with different climate and extreme events. And these measures are maybe not sufficient anymore in the face of climate change, but it is important to learn and build upon them in the development of